What if the person you trusted most plotted your death with the person you feared least? This is the question that haunted me long after I closed the case file on Captain Marty Theer. How does a respected Air Force officer, a man who served his country with honor and dedication, end up gunned down in cold blood, not by a stranger, but by someone carefully chosen as a pawn in a deadly love triangle? December 17, 2000. Fayetteville, North Carolina. The winter air bites through the darkness as Captain Marty Theer steps out of his white sedan in the parking lot of a counseling office. He's here for what he believes is a marriage counseling session, a chance to save his struggling relationship with his wife Michelle. The shots ring out like thunder in the quiet night. 3 bullets find their mark. Marty collapses to the cold asphalt, his life bleeding away into the darkness. But here's the shocking part. This was no random crime. This was no robbery gone wrong. This was planned with chilling precision by the 2 people who should have protected him most: his wife and the soldier she convinced to pull the trigger. To understand how we arrived at that terrible December night, we need to go back to the late 1990s, when Marty and Michelle Theer seemed to have everything. Captain Marty Theer was the embodiment of military excellence. At 31, he had built a distinguished career in the Air Force, earning the respect of his colleagues and superiors alike. Those who knew him described a man of unwavering integrity, disciplined, reliable, and deeply committed to both his service and his family. He was the kind of man you could count on, whether in a crisis overseas or at a neighborhood barbecue. Michelle Theer was his perfect complement, or so it seemed. Beautiful, charismatic, and intelligent, she possessed an almost magnetic personality that drew people to her. With her striking looks and quick wit, Michelle could command attention in any room she entered. Friends described her as vivacious, someone who lit up social gatherings with her presence. From the outside, the Theers appeared to be living the American dream. They had a beautiful home in Fayetteville, near Fort Bragg where Marty was stationed. They seemed financially stable, socially connected, and genuinely happy together. Wedding photos showed a couple radiating joy and promise. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage, cracks were beginning to form. Michelle, for all her outward charm, was growing restless. The structured life of a military wife, the predictable routines, the social expectations, the long deployments, began to feel like a cage. What happens when love begins to feel like a prison? What happens when someone who craves excitement finds themselves trapped in a life that feels increasingly ordinary? For Michelle Theer, the answer would prove devastating. In 1999, Michelle made a career decision that would seem almost prophetic in hindsight. She took a job as a marriage counselor, helping other couples navigate the troubled waters of their relationships. The irony was lost on no one who knew the true state of her own marriage. It was through her work in the counseling field that Michelle would meet the man who would ultimately destroy everything. John Diamond was 24 years old, 6 years younger than Michelle, and everything that Marty was not. Where Marty was steady and predictable, John was intense and unpredictable. An Army Ranger stationed at Fort Bragg, John possessed the kind of raw, physical presence that turned heads. He was muscular, confident, and carried himself with the swagger of a soldier who had seen action. But beneath John's tough exterior lay something more vulnerable, an impressionable young man desperately seeking connection and meaning. He was the kind of person who, once he committed to something or someone, would do so with absolute devotion. When Michelle and John first met, the attraction was immediate and electric. For Michelle, John represented everything her marriage lacked: danger, passion, unpredictability. For John, Michelle was sophisticated, beautiful, and unlike anyone he had ever met. Their affair began quietly, stolen moments in coffee shops and brief encounters that felt harmless enough. But as weeks turned into months, their relationship grew increasingly reckless. Michelle began living a dangerous double life, devoted wife by day, passionate lover by night. John's feelings for Michelle quickly moved beyond simple attraction into something far more intense. He was obsessed with her, hanging on her every word, desperate to please her in any way he could. Michelle, recognizing the power she held over him, began to test the boundaries of his devotion. She would whisper promises of a future together, painting pictures of the life they could have if only circumstances were different. She spoke of feeling trapped, of longing for freedom, of dreaming about what could be. But to be with John forever, Michelle needed Marty gone. As 2000 progressed, Michelle became a master at maintaining her double life. By day, she was the dutiful military wife, cooking dinner, attending social functions, playing the role that was expected of her. By night, she was someone entirely different, passionate, free, alive in ways that her marriage never allowed. Marty, focused on his demanding career and trusting in his marriage, suspected nothing. He saw Michelle's mood improvements as a positive sign, perhaps evidence that she was finding fulfillment in her counseling work. He had no idea that his wife was conducting an affair that was growing more serious by the day. But Michelle was doing more than just cheating. She was systematically poisoning John's mind against her husband. In their private moments together, Michelle began painting Marty as something he was not. She told John that Marty was controlling, emotionally abusive, and potentially dangerous. She claimed that she lived in fear, that her husband's military training made him unpredictable and threatening. None of this was true. Marty was, by all accounts, a gentleman who had never shown any signs of violence toward his wife. But Michelle's lies were carefully crafted, designed to play on John's protective instincts and his growing love for her. John believed every word. Why wouldn't he? The woman he loved was telling him she was in danger, that she needed his protection. His training as a ranger had taught him to protect the innocent and fight for what was right. In his mind, Michelle was both innocent and in need of rescue. As Michelle continued to weave her web of deception, those watching began to wonder, was she a victim caught between two worlds, or was she a master manipulator orchestrating something far more sinister? The answer would soon become terrifyingly clear. By the fall of 2000, Michelle and John's conversations had taken a dark turn. What had once been fantasies about being together had evolved into something far more concrete and disturbing. If Marty wasn't around, Michelle would whisper during their secret meetings, we could finally be together. We could have the life we've always talked about. At first, these conversations remained in the realm of wishful thinking. But gradually they became more specific, more detailed, more real. John, blinded by his love for Michelle and convinced that she was in genuine danger, began to see Marty not as an innocent husband but as an obstacle to their happiness and Michelle's safety. In his mind, he wasn't planning a murder, he was planning a rescue. Michelle was careful to never explicitly order John to kill her husband. Instead, she planted seeds, made suggestions, and allowed John's own devotion to fill in the blanks. She was manipulating him with the skill of someone who understood exactly how to push his psychological buttons. As December approached, their planning became more serious. Michelle began working out the details of how to get Marty to a location where John could act without witnesses or interruption. The solution was diabolically simple. Michelle would schedule a marriage counseling session for the evening of December 17th at her counseling office. She would tell Marty that this was a last-ditch effort to save their marriage, an appeal he couldn't refuse given his commitment to their relationship. Marty, trusting his wife and genuinely wanting to repair their marriage, agreed immediately. He had no idea he was walking straight into an ambush planned by the woman he loved and the soldier she had convinced to kill him. December 17, 2000, was bitterly cold in Fayetteville. As evening fell, Marty Theer drove to his wife's counseling office, probably thinking about what he might say to help save his marriage. Perhaps he was nervous, hopeful, or simply determined to do whatever it took to make things work with Michelle. He parked his white sedan in the small parking lot outside the counseling center and stepped out into the frigid air. The lot was poorly lit, casting long shadows that provided perfect cover for someone waiting in the darkness. John Diamond had been there for over an hour, positioned where he could see Marty's approach but remain hidden himself. He was armed with a .357 Magnum, a weapon capable of devastating damage. His hands were steady. His ranger training had prepared him for moments like this. As Marty walked toward the building, John emerged from the shadows. There was no conversation, no final confrontation between the two men. John simply raised his weapon and fired. The first shot struck Marty in the torso, spinning him around. The second and third shots ensured there would be no recovery, no chance for Marty to identify his attacker or call for help. Captain Marty Theer, a decorated Air Force officer, devoted husband and father, died on that cold asphalt in a matter of seconds. His life ended not in service to his country, but as the victim of a betrayal so complete it defied comprehension. Within minutes of the shooting, Michelle arrived at the scene. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, screaming, crying, collapsing next to her husband's body in apparent grief. To the first responders who arrived, she looked like exactly what she claimed to be, a devastated wife who had discovered her husband's body. But behind those tears, behind that carefully constructed facade of grief, something sinister was hiding. Something that would soon make investigators question everything they thought they knew about this case. In the immediate aftermath of Marty's murder, investigators treated it as they would any violent crime. The scene was processed, evidence was collected, and witnesses were interviewed. Initially, the working theory was robbery. Perhaps Marty had surprised a thief, or maybe he had been targeted for his wallet or vehicle. But as the investigation progressed, that theory began to fall apart. Nothing had been stolen from Marty's person or his car. His wallet was intact, his vehicle was undamaged, and there were no signs of a struggle that would indicate he had fought off an attacker. More puzzling was the location. Why would a robber choose a small counseling office parking lot on a Sunday evening? The area wasn't known for random crime, and there were far more lucrative targets nearby. Detective work began to focus on the most fundamental question in any murder investigation: who would want Marty Theer dead? By all accounts, Marty was a well-liked, respected member of both the military and civilian communities. He had no known enemies, no gambling debts, no involvement in anything that would make him a target for violence. His colleagues described him as professional and fair, never one to make enemies or engage in conflicts. But as investigators dug deeper into Marty's personal life, questions began to emerge about his marriage. Neighbors mentioned that Michelle had seemed distant lately, that the couple hadn't been seen together as much as they used to be. Friends noted that Michelle's behavior at the crime scene, while emotional, had seemed somehow performed. The breakthrough came when investigators began examining phone records and interviewing Michelle's colleagues at the counseling center. What they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Michelle Theer was having an affair. and her lover was a young, highly trained soldier named John Diamond. Suddenly, the grieving widow looked more like a suspect. When John Diamond was first brought in for questioning, he maintained his composure with military discipline. He admitted to knowing Michelle through her work, acknowledged that they had become friends, but initially denied any romantic relationship. But as investigators pressed harder, armed with phone records that showed hundreds of calls between them, John's story began to change. He was, after all, a young man caught in an impossible situation, torn between his training, which taught him never to betray a confidence, and the growing evidence that was painting him into a corner. Under pressure, John finally admitted to the affair. The details that emerged painted a picture of a relationship that had consumed both of them completely. They spoke multiple times every day, met whenever possible, and had begun making increasingly serious plans for a future together. But John insisted that Michelle had been the victim of an abusive marriage, that Marty had been controlling and potentially dangerous. He genuinely believed that Michelle lived in fear of her husband, and that belief had justified, in his mind, the actions he had taken. As investigators continued to interview John, they began to see the full scope of Michelle's manipulation. She had systematically convinced this young soldier that her husband was a threat, that she needed protection, and that John was the only one who could save her. The evidence against John was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him near the scene at the time of the murder. Ballistics tests would later confirm that the murder weapon belonged to him. Phone records showed that he had spoken with Michelle multiple times on the day of the murder, including shortly after Marty's death. Faced with this evidence, John finally confessed. But his confession came with a crucial detail that would define the rest of the case. He insisted that Michelle had orchestrated the entire thing. John Diamond, once Michelle's devoted soldier of love, had now become the state's most powerful weapon against her. The courtroom was packed as Michelle Theer's trial began. The case had captured national attention. A beautiful marriage counselor accused of manipulating her young lover into murdering her husband was the kind of story that fascinated and horrified the public in equal measure. The prosecution painted Michelle as a master manipulator, a woman who had callously used John Diamond's love and military training to eliminate the one obstacle to her freedom. They presented evidence of the affair, the phone records, and most damaging of all, John Diamond's testimony. John took the stand and, with military precision, detailed how Michelle had gradually convinced him that Marty was abusive and dangerous. He described conversations where Michelle had spoken about feeling trapped, about needing someone to protect her, about dreaming of a life where she could be free. The prosecution argued that Michelle had never directly ordered John to kill her husband because she was too smart for that. Instead, she had planted the idea, nurtured it, and then provided the perfect opportunity by luring Marty to the counseling office that night. The defense countered with a different narrative. They portrayed Michelle as a woman caught in the middle of a deteriorating marriage who had sought comfort in another relationship, something regrettable but hardly unusual. They argued that John Diamond was an unstable young man who had become obsessed with Michelle and had acted on his own initiative. The defense suggested that Michelle was as much a victim as Marty, a woman who had never intended for her affair to lead to murder, who had been horrified when John took matters into his own hands. But as the trial progressed, evidence emerged that undermined Michelle's claims of innocence. Letters between her and John revealed the depth of their planning. Recorded conversations showed Michelle encouraging John's protective instincts and his anger toward Marty. Perhaps most damaging of all were the testimony of friends and colleagues who revealed that Michelle had shown little genuine grief after Marty's death. Within weeks of becoming a widow, she had been seen laughing, socializing, and acting more like a woman who had been freed than one who had been devastated. Marty's family sat in the courtroom day after day, watching as the woman they had trusted and welcomed into their lives was revealed to be something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The betrayal was almost as devastating as the original loss. As the trial neared its conclusion, it seemed certain that Michelle would be convicted. The evidence was overwhelming, John's testimony was compelling, and the prosecution had successfully painted her as a cold, calculating killer. But just when the truth seemed within reach, Michelle Theer simply vanished. On the morning of April 12, 2002, just days before her trial was scheduled to conclude, Michelle Theer failed to appear in court. A quick check of her home revealed that she had packed her belongings and disappeared without a trace. The news sent shockwaves through North Carolina and beyond. How could a prime suspect in a high-profile murder case simply disappear? How had she managed to slip away from the intense scrutiny that surrounded her? The investigation into Michelle's escape revealed a level of planning that demonstrated just how calculating she truly was. She had been preparing for months, slowly liquidating assets, establishing false identities, and creating escape routes that law enforcement hadn't anticipated. Michelle Theer had become one of America's most wanted fugitives, and the manhunt that followed was unlike anything the region had seen in years. Months turned into years with no sign of Michelle. Investigators received tips from across the country, reported sightings in California, Texas, Florida, and a dozen other states. Each lead was pursued vigorously, but none led to her capture. The question that haunted everyone was simple: where was she? Had she built a new life somewhere, perhaps with a new identity and new victims to manipulate? Was she working, dating, maybe even married again? Was she still out there, using her charm and intelligence to manipulate someone else? The thought that Michelle might be living freely while Marty lay dead and John Diamond sat in prison was almost too much for those who knew the case to bear. On December 13, 2002, nearly 2 years after Marty's murder and 8 months after Michelle's disappearance, the manhunt finally came to an end. Michelle was captured in Delray Beach, Florida, where she had been living under the false identity of Denise Green. She had found work at a medical clinic, rented a small apartment, and was attempting to build the kind of quiet, normal life that had once felt so suffocating to her. But even in hiding, Michelle couldn't completely change who she was. Neighbors would later describe her as charming and social, someone who quickly made friends and became involved in local activities. She had, it seemed, been attempting to recreate the kind of life she had before, minus the inconvenience of a husband she no longer wanted. Her capture came through the kind of painstaking police work that defines the best investigations. A tip from someone who recognized her from America's Most Wanted led to surveillance, which confirmed her identity and location. When FBI agents knocked on her door that December morning, Michelle's reaction was telling. Rather than surprise or fear, witnesses described something closer to resignation, as if she had always known this moment would come. The glamorous marriage counselor who had once commanded attention in every room now faced the reality that her freedom had been an illusion. She was returned to North Carolina to face the justice that had been waiting for her. Michelle Theer's trial resumed with even greater intensity after her capture. The fact that she had fled made her look even more guilty in the eyes of the jury, and her conviction was swift and decisive. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to manipulate and destroy the lives of others. John Diamond, who had cooperated fully with the prosecution and testified against Michelle, received a lesser sentence. He would eventually be released after serving his time, though the weight of what he had done would follow him for the rest of his life. But for all the legal resolution, for all the justice that was served, the Marty Theer case left questions that continue to haunt those who studied it closely. Marty Theer had been betrayed not by an enemy or a stranger, but by the woman he had trusted most in the world. He had died believing he was going to a counseling session to save his marriage, never knowing that his wife had already decided he needed to die. His family was left to grapple with a loss that defied understanding. How do you mourn someone who was killed not by bad luck or random violence, but by calculated betrayal? How do you process the fact that someone you welcomed into your family, someone you loved and trusted, was capable of such devastating deception? Marty's children would grow up without their father, robbed of the man who should have taught them about honor, integrity, and service. They would have to live with the knowledge that their father died not as a hero in service to his country, but as the victim of their mother's selfish ambition. John Diamond remains imprisoned, a man who threw away his promising military career and his freedom for a love that was never real. He was a victim of Michelle's manipulation, but he was also the instrument of an innocent man's death. The complexity of his situation, both perpetrator and victim, makes his story one of the most tragic aspects of this case. And Michelle Theer lives behind bars, her once vibrant double life reduced to the confines of a single cell. The woman who craved excitement and freedom now faces decades of the most restrictive existence possible, with nothing but time to reflect on the destruction she caused. But this case wasn't just about murder. It wasn't just about adultery or manipulation or betrayal, though it contained all of those elements. The Marty Theer case was about something deeper and more disturbing. It was about the darkest side of human nature, about the capacity for evil that can hide behind the most beautiful faces and charming personalities. It made me question everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and humanity itself. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What are they capable of when they think they can get away with it? And how many Michelle Theers are out there right now, living double lives, manipulating the people who love them, plotting betrayals that will destroy families and shatter lives? These are the questions that keep investigators awake at night, that make us look a little more carefully at the people around us, that remind us that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers in dark alleys, but from the people we trust enough to let into our homes and our hearts. Captain Marty Theer deserved better. He deserved to live, to raise his children, to continue serving his country with the honor and integrity that defined his life. Instead, he became the victim of a betrayal so complete and calculated that it challenges our understanding of human nature itself. His story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a beautiful face, speaks with a charming voice, and destroys lives with a smile. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all.
Thanks for tuning in to The Witness Wall. If you're new to this channel, kindly like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.